Glasgow. Ciao, CO2. Chris, thank you very much indeed for your welcome. To those of you who stayed on from the business breakfast, you're welcome again to our two-day conference. If we'd been here 100 years ago, we would have probably been drowned out by the noise of all of the activity and the bustle of the docks that surrounded the South Rotunda, with produce from all over the world coming into Glasgow for onward distribution through the UK and into Europe. And then further downstream, the extraordinary shipyards, Lithgow's, Brown, Fairfield, and all the others, where Clyde built became synonymous with entrepreneurial spirit, with innovation, and a sense that nothing was too great a challenge. And what we hope to do over the next 2 days is to try and rediscover that spirit of entrepreneurialism, that spirit of innovation, as we look at the challenges facing us to bring to market the huge marine energy resources that surround these islands. And how will we share that knowledge with other countries, with the emerging energy economies, countries which over the river today are pledging to end coal, countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia, with huge wind, wave and tidal resources of their own, but who need the bulk generation to drive their economies into the 21st century. And tomorrow, in our second day, we'll explore issues like interconnection and the creation of the super grids that will bring all of this power to consumers many thousands of kilometers away. And then interspersed between the main panel sessions, we'll have a series of fireside chats trying to unpick some of the knotty issues that are being wrestled with over the water in the rather less salubrious tents than the one we're gathered in this morning. So tomorrow morning I'll be on stage chatting to Laura Sands and Karen Billamoria about innovation, and later today we have Mike Hayes and Wafa Jaffrey of KPMG talking about corporate offtake. But to get us underway, to launch us metaphorically down the Clyde and out to sea, it's my huge pleasure to welcome Gillian Watson and her panel of Tim Lord, Kingsmill Bond and Mary Quaney as they kick us off by discussing the energy transition that is before us and unveils all of the opportunities that await us. And we've also brought the furniture along with me as well. So please, ladies and gentlemen, will you give a big hand to Gillian and the first panel? Thank you very much.
I'll go at the end and then wherever.
Sure.
Excellent. Well, while we seem to be stocked with all the refreshments that we might like, I'd just like to welcome everybody to the first session of this two-day conference sponsored by Mainstream Renewable Power and the Global Wind Energy Council. This is as many people as I've seen in one room since March 2020, and it's a delight to be back at conferences again. Definitely not words I ever thought I would be saying. So over the next 55 minutes, we will discuss and debate the energy system of tomorrow, sharing views on what it is and what that means. We have an accomplished panel of speakers whose insights and experiences will both inform and enlighten, and it's a great pleasure to welcome them all here today. On my left, Kingsmill Bond. Kingsmill has worked as an analyst and strategist for 25 years in London, Moscow and Hong Kong, and joined Carbon Tracker at the end of 2017. He's also a member of the Global Future Council on Energy Transition for the World Economic Forum. Kingsmill believes that the energy transition is the most important driver of financial markets and geopolitics in the modern era, and has written many pieces on that subject. As he said in a recent podcast, a new world is being born that is powered by energy that is cheap, local and eternal. The process of change will be messy, but the future is bright. More on that to come. Next to Kingsmill, Tim Lord. Tim leads work on net zero and climate change for the Tony Blair Institute. He has almost 20 years' experience working on climate, energy and industrial policy, most recently as Director responsible for the UK government's decarbonisation strategy. In a recent article on the current energy crisis, he wrote, "The current political headache is a symptom of an underlying market framework that has not kept pace with the rapid transformation of the energy sector." I'm sure that's a topic we'll cover in today's discussion. And last but not least, Mary Kwane. Mary was appointed Group CEO of Mainstream in August 2020, having joined the company in 2009 and held the role of Group Chief Financial Officer since 2017. She previously held senior level positions in finance and corporate tax in PwC and Trinity Biotech PLC. She's an advocate and spokesperson on gender diversity and participated as a mentor in the Global Wind Energy Council's Women in Wind programme in 2019. Welcome everyone. So without further ado, let's leap straight into the topic for this session, the energy system of tomorrow, generally defined as renewables driven, innovative and integrated. So the transition has started, but there's a long way to go. So what does it mean to you, each of the members of our panel? Kingsmill, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thank you very much for having me at this event. And I think before I plunge in, I just want to make 4 general points, if I may, about the energy transition. Because, well, the first is that it is, at heart, a technology shift. It's a technology transition. Which for us in financial markets is something we see all the time. And you see this in your own lifetimes with the rise of the iPhone and the internet, all the rest of it. It's just a technology transition at heart. Cheaper, cleaner, granular, local technologies of renewables. And for energy geeks such as myself, in more technical terms, the energy return on investment of oil and gas and coal has been falling over the years, and the energy return on investment of renewable energy technologies overtook them actually about 7 or 8 years ago and keeps on rising. So for every barrel of oil you get out of the ground, you have to spend 0.14 barrels to get the thing in the first place, and you get an energy payback in many new energy technologies in about 6 months, and they last for 30 years. So it's at heart a technology shift. The second point I think to emphasize is that the driver of change of the energy transition is specifically the growth of new energy technologies. So don't worry what Shell is doing and BP and Exxon, all these guys. It's what Mary's doing. It's the growth of the new that's driving out the old, because these technologies are growing at 20-25% in the case of solar, 10-15% in the case of wind, electric vehicles at 50%. The point simply is these technologies are on exponential growth curves called S-curves. The third general point is there are 4 the 4 horsemen of the technology transition are solar, wind, batteries and green hydrogen. They're all on these extraordinary technology learning curves. I guess it doesn't feel like that when you're in the middle of it, and it's really tough, and you've got speakers earlier were talking about the pressures they felt on margins, but nevertheless, there's a very interesting paper recently released by Oxford University which demonstrates that first of all, those 4 technologies are on learning curves whereby their costs fall by between 16 and 34% for every doubling in capacity. And then secondly, most importantly, that learning curves are sticky. So this is going to continue for years, if not decades to come. Costs are going to keep on falling, and that will change everything. And then the final general point I'll make, if I may, is that these technologies have only recently got big enough to be material and to really damage the incumbent system. So when you're 0.1% of the global energy system as they were a decade ago, and you're growing quickly, it doesn't really matter for the incumbents. But now, solar and wind are 10% of global electricity generation. They're growing at 20%. That means they're going to take all of the growth in a 2% growth system. And you're seeing the same thing happening in sector after sector of the incumbency, as you're seeing a peaking demand for incumbent products. So just quickly to answer these 2 other questions in terms of framing the debate, when it comes to speed, the issue to watch is not when do challengers get to 100%. So it's quite interesting. A lot of the incumbency and people like Václav Smil and Exxon and so on keep on saying, well, it will take a very long time for renewables and solar and wind to get to 100% market share. That completely misses the point. The question is, when do they get big enough to drive a peak in incumbent demand? And we're already seeing this. We've seen peak fossil fuel electricity in Europe in 2013, peak gas turbines, peak coal in 2013, peak ICE cars in 2017. And because financial markets anticipate my own background, they're already pricing this in right now. So you're getting a fossil fuel derating at the same time as you're getting a massive re-rating of all these new energy technologies. Go and take a look at the share prices of electric vehicles and hydrogen stocks and so on and so forth. So the 2020s will be the decade of peaks for the incumbents and rapid recognition and exponential growth opportunities for the challengers. And finally, the implications of all of this. I'll just highlight three, if I may. First of all, they're very wide and profound. The energy system is the foundation of everything else. Obviously, we all use energy for everything. So you change energy, everything will change. Secondly, you can go even further. Energy historians like Ian Morris divide energy eras into four. They talk about foragers, farmers, fossil fuels. You can sort of see the framing of foragers, and then farmers come along and your energy returns increase 100-fold, and then fossil fuels come along after 1800, thanks to James Watt and Glasgow, and increase another 60-fold. And now suddenly we have a new era of renewables where you have these much higher return energy technologies. So it is going to be a new era. And then specifically, I think if I focus on companies and then conclude the geopolitics, on companies, you will, as I say, see the decline of the fossil fuel incumbents and the producers and the users, incidentally. The new mantra really is change to survive. So it's all this greenwashing we're seeing all the time from the incumbents. It's kind of irrelevant because they have to change or they won't be here anymore in a decade or so. And then secondly, you're seeing the rise of new energy leaders. So Mainstream or Longi or Vestas or Cattle. This is a kind of Cambrian moment where there are huge opportunities, and we were just debating this earlier. Perhaps Scotland will grow a number of massive new energy companies by grabbing the moment. And then finally, in terms of geopolitics, well, it's sort of obvious. You're going to see the decline of the petrostates. So we, at the moment, are still spending 2% of global GDP, which we're sending to these petrostates every year, and they've been doing it for decades, and they will decline. Secondly, you'll see the rise of new energy importers, and I think this is particularly, the rise of countries which are currently massive importers of energy. So think about a place like India, spending a third of its foreign import budget on buying energy. Think about Africa, with 38% of global renewable capacity. You're going to see a very profound shift towards countries which are renewable energy superpowers. And therefore, I conclude my final point, which is that new energy leaders such as Scotland, which has got this massive externality, massive positive external resource, are in a tremendous position to exploit it and enhance their position. So I hope that's a useful initial framing of the debate.
Thank you very much. Tim?
Yeah, sure. I think when we think about kind of what does the energy system of the future look like, I think the first thing I'd say is, like, it kind of feels, certainly I've been working in energy for 20 years, many of you for as long as that and longer, and it sort of feels like we've been going through a huge transition. But I guess the main point is that we haven't seen anything yet, right? When I think back to the first COP, 1995, we were getting about 89% of our energy globally from fossil fuels. We're now getting about 84% of our energy globally from fossil fuels, give or take. You know, we've been burning stuff, you know, you talked about the 4 energy eras, but we've basically been burning stuff for 500,000 years, and we need to stop in 30. And so the scale of this transition, I think, is really only just getting started, and you mentioned some of the S-curves that we're going to be going through. And for me, what that means is that we're a long way from where we need to be in terms of the kind of markets that we're going to have to drive that transition. The markets we have are still essentially fossil fuel markets, to which we've added lots and lots of bells and whistles to try and get the right technologies, the low carbon technologies of the future onto the system. And for me, there's kind of 3 things that we need to be worrying about as we undergo that incredibly rapid transition in the next 30 years. And the first one is scale, because, you know, the UK, we have made enormous progress in the power sector in the last decade in particular. We've now got, if you count everything low carbon on the system, we've got about 200 terawatt hours of low carbon electricity on the system if you include renewables, nuclear, biomass, let's not go there. In that, you've got 200 terawatt hours. Now, in 20 years, we're going to need 600 terawatt hours. So that means, we've been adding about 10 a year for the last decade. We're going to need to add 20 a year, every year, for the next 20 years. Now, that's the equivalent of about a gigawatt of new offshore wind every 10 weeks for 20 years. And every week that we're not doing that, we're increasing the scale for the latter part. And so that's kind of scale of challenge, I think, at the moment, is a little bit underpriced. I think the second problem that we've got and the challenge that we need to address is around incentives. The way that our markets are designed is essentially around fossil fuel markets with gas setting the price and all those kind of things, and all of the market instruments we put in place have accepted that existing reality and sort of augmented it. Whereas the next phase is going to have much more localized pricing to get those incentives right. We're going to need to think really hard about the incentives on renewable plant, which in the past has just been about build it and produce as much as you can whenever you can. That's fine at the moment. I'm not sure that is fine in 10, 15 years' time when we're getting 80, 85, 90% potentially of our terawatt hours from renewables. And also the incentives around security of supply. I've spent 20 years in government, and security of supply is sort of the thing that we need to not make sure we don't forget. We quite often talk about a renewables heavy system. I believe we can have a secure renewables heavy system, but we are not going to have a secure renewables heavy system with the market structures that we have in place at the moment. And believe me, when you talk to ministers about this stuff, it is the first thing they worry about, and what's been happening in the last few months has certainly been a reminder of that. And then the third and final thing I'd mention is about consumers, because really over the last century, consumers have just been at the end of the pipe, right? They pay their bills hopefully on time, and they use energy when we need it, and we flex our supply to meet their demand. And I think there's two big things that have to change around that. The first is the value that consumers can provide to the system is enormous. When we just think about, in those 20 years I talked about, we're going to have 40 million electric vehicles on the system, providing huge amounts of storage and flexibility capability, but not currently strongly incentivized to do so. But the other really important point that I think we sometimes forget, a lot of us are engineers or we're economists and so on, is the politics of this transition. Energy politics actually in the last 20 years has been pretty quiet when you compare it to centuries, frankly, before that. But the politics of energy in the next 20 or 30 years is not going to be like that. And we've seen that just in the last few weeks as we've seen what's happened in wholesale markets. We've seen that feeding through to consumers. Just wait till next April when the price cap goes up £400 or £500. That's going to be hugely, it's going to bring politics absolutely to the fore of all of this. So how we're engaging consumers in this transition, how we're enabling them to provide value, and crucially, how we're enabling them to provide value in a fair way that means everyone can access that value and benefit from it, feels to me like one of the biggest challenges as well.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and then Mary.
Thank you, Gillian. And from the renewable energy perspective, let me just start with again, taking a step back in time. Our company, Mainstream Renewable Power, was founded back in 2008, and I often remind people that the name was very carefully chosen because of the vision of renewable energy one day becoming mainstream, hence Mainstream Renewable Power. And that was in 2008. It's not that long ago, really, in terms of the annals of time. It's 13 years ago. And the conversation has moved, obviously, very dramatically, substantially since then, so that, renewable energy really is today mainstream and will be certainly the case in the future, and is the solution in terms of the decarbonisation of the energy system. And that's not a topic for debate. But the scope of the transition that lies ahead of us, as Tim said, we're really only at the very early days of it. And the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency are completely aligned in pointing out that by 2050, half of the world's energy will be provided by electricity, and of that 90% will be delivered by wind and solar power, so from about 10% today. And then on top of that, a further 20% of our energy will come from hydrogen, which will be manufactured mainly from renewable energy from wind and solar power. So, the standing start of where we are today versus where we need to be in 2050, it really is turning the energy system and the energy markets of today completely on their heads. And then the speed at which we have to do that transition. A major advantage of wind and solar power is, particularly onshore, is that projects can be developed and delivered and commissioned faster, and at scale much faster than fossil alternatives. So very coal and fossil heavy dependent economies really have an opportunity to accelerate their deployment of renewable energy. But however, the speed at which that's happening today, both in right across all sectors, it's just not happening at the scale and speed at which it needs to happen. We need to quadruple wind energy installations each and every year, and we need obviously the depth and the supply chain and the line of sight to markets to do that. And then, of course, the scale, we discussed earlier the opportunity for Europe, and more than the opportunity, the absolute need to build hundreds of gigawatts of offshore wind, both fixed and floating. And we need an interconnected, sophisticated transmission network that certainly isn't there today, so as to deploy that energy swiftly, cost effectively, and much more sophisticated and a much more international network than what is the case today. So the topic for this morning's discussion really couldn't be more pertinent in terms of really having to turn the whole energy system entirely on its head to deploy this transition.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots to cover there, but I'd like to pick up on a couple of points. I mean, one of them just on that one, our electricity systems are built around traditional fossil fuel generation assets, and I mean, the balancing and the everything that we've done to provide electricity 24/7 to the community. So why does this not work for a renewables-based system, and what do we need to change as we build out this huge installed capacity of renewables? Tim, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you say, we do have a market that's structured around fossil assets. Think back to 1990-ish when we liberalised the system. The reforms around 2000, then electricity market reform. The fundamentals of that system have not changed. We've got a wholesale market where gas, or previously coal, sets the price. And that is going to change very fundamentally as we bring more renewables onto the system. And essentially, we have a system that's designed for relatively low capital cost, high running cost, dispatchable capacity. And what we're trying to bring onto the system is basically the opposite of that. And we're trying to do that at the moment in a market that is not designed for it. And when I think back to when we did the electricity market reform program and we introduced the CFD, and we worked very closely with Mainstream and many other developers to do that, and I think it is a pretty effective instrument. When you look at the onshore and offshore deployment that we've seen in the last few years, I think that's testament to that. But essentially, if you think about the energy market as a lasagna, we added a couple more layers to the lasagna, but we still had a lasagna at the end of it. Whereas actually that isn't what we need. We don't need a lasagna anymore. We need something completely different. And for me, what the challenge is about how do you move from a system where the incentives that we're placing on renewables developers is basically build, we'll de-risk your build, and then just generate and put your energy onto the system, and then it's someone else's problem to figure out how that works, into one where we are integrating that supply, which has huge advantages in terms of cost and in terms of volume, but also has some real challenges in terms of non-dispatchability and so on. How do we combine that with the consumption and demand side, providing value, and also in other technologies, whether it's nuclear, whether it's storage, whether it's some of the other technologies that we need to augment renewables and to work around them, with renewables absolutely providing the backbone of the system. And for me, the challenge is that we need to do that pretty fast. At the moment, we've got, I think, about 6 or 7% of generation in the UK market is on a contract for difference. In about 15 years, that's going to be 90 or 95% with the set of incentives that we have at the moment. And that feels like a really difficult system to manage. It feels like a system where you're going to have incredibly spiky prices and unpredictable prices. Feels like a system where the incentives for the technologies that we need around those renewables is not going to be there. And that's why I think we would, and I would certainly strongly advocate that while we have had a lot of success in the last 5 or 10 years, we do need to transition to a new system, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't pause and slow investment over the next 5 or 10 years, given the scale of what we need to do.
Thank you. So, from a UK perspective, we have a very well-developed market, and that's sometimes difficult because you need to change it. But Mary, your Mainstream is operating in markets where maybe they don't have any infrastructure, and how's that from a development point of view? And our minds focused on not just getting the installed capacity, but actually being able to get it where it's needed.
Yeah, many of our markets, such as Vietnam, South Africa, Indonesia, we selected because of the ability for renewable energy to play a really significant role on the energy system, and to decrease dependency on very coal-based systems. And it's encouraging now that today that the top 10 coal-based countries all now have net zero targets as of this week. But you're right in that it's clearly it's one thing for the UK to transition, and it has been a leader in terms of the deployment of renewable energy. But if you think about the perspective, if you're the Minister of Energy or the Finance Ministry in a large emerging economy such as Vietnam or Indonesia, how to plan for that rapid transformation, not just in the power sector, but also in the transport sector. And if you think of, I know, Gillian, Vietnam very well also, and if you think of the clogging of the streets with mopeds, and in fact the clogging of the footpaths as well, not just the actual streets. Thinking of the level of which that whole infrastructure has to change to electric vehicles and that whole transformation that has to take place. The challenges really are immense, and a key focus, rightly, of this week and of the COP leadership has to be on deploying the capital from the more developed countries to the developing countries to enable that transformation. And announcements such as significant amounts of capital that was announced this week to invest in South Africa in terms of building out transmission infrastructure, repurposing coal plants. Similarly, there are discussions underway similarly for Vietnam. Like, it's that level of really deep-seated change that is required for countries such as those, which have the opportunity. And I believe that actually what we'll see in time is that they will leapfrog the transition that other than more advanced economies have made, and it'll be a case of leaping directly towards the deployment of renewable energy, and it has to be that way.
Okay, thank you. So Kingsmill, again, from a global perspective and the energy system of the future, aside from the installed capacity, and then potentially touch on the role of storage and interconnection.
So if I may, I just want to pick up on this leapfrog point,
Yes.
because it's really significant. If you look around the world, we're using whatever it is, 8 megawatt hours per person, 10 megawatt hours per person in the UK, and the global average is 3.5, and you've got India on 1 and many countries on less than 1. So it's as simple as, if the emerging markets don't leapfrog, there will be no energy transition. So this is why Mary's point is incredibly important. We have to make sure the technology gets out there. Unfortunately, it is happening. So to give you a couple of stats, we wrote a paper about this at Carbon Tracker a few months ago. And so 99% of developed markets, we've already seen peak demand for fossil fuels for electricity generation. It's already happened in 63% of emerging markets. And it's about to happen in China. Once China goes over the edge, that's basically it. So the leapfrog is happening, and you can see exactly what's going on in India and the aspirations of the Indian government to get all of the growth of their electricity from renewables because it's cheaper. So I think that is happening. Just then to make a couple of other general points, if I may, on this. Clearly, as we found out in the UK, you can't build, well, precisely as Tim has said, you can't build a new system on the assumptions of the old system. So we're going to need more storage. And we're just going to have to reconfigure. And I think there's going to be a policy competition now globally amongst policymakers to find out the best way to solve this. And it's not necessarily, we haven't worked it out, but it cannot be beyond the wit of humanity to work out a way of bringing in zero-cost energy into a system. And there are plenty of different solutions being trialed out there, and they will be found.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, one of the key inputs to achieving these ambitious targets is finance. Sorry. Is my microphone working? Yes.
Yes.
With huge sums required to realise the dream. So any thoughts on the financing of net zero and ensuring capital is employed in the amounts required? And I'll start with you, Kingsmill. Well,
if I may, I mean, I guess this is what we do is we're looking specifically at this incredibly important issue. And there's an awful lot of numbers knocking around when it comes to financing of the energy transition. So yesterday, Al Gore was talking about $100 to $150 trillion, and Rishi Sunak also mentioned this $100 trillion number. And it sounds enormous, but fortunately, as I'm going to seek to lay out in a moment, it's much, much simpler than that. It's much more achievable. The overall absolutely core point to be made is that money is like water, and it flows to where the opportunity lies. And now that the balance of economics favors renewables, money inevitably is flowing and will continue to flow towards renewable energy technologies. That's one generic point. Then when it comes to the actual numbers, let me just, if you'll bear with me for a moment, play with the numbers for a second. We at the moment spend $2.6 trillion a year globally, according to the IEA, on our energy system. So that's like grids and fossil fuels and power stations, all the rest of it. $2.6 trillion a year. According to the IEA, it will take $3.6 trillion a year to create a renewable energy system. So forget about 100 trillion. We're talking about incremental cost $1 trillion a year. That's the first point. The second then is that this CapEx debate should not be held in isolation, because you spend CapEx to build a new system. So we'll have to do this for 20 to 30 years. We'll have to build out the new system. But in the meantime, we have a fossil fuel system at the moment, which, as I mentioned earlier, requires us to spend 2% of global GDP, about $2 trillion a year, on sending petrodollars to oligarchs in the Middle East and the CIS. So we will save, ultimately, $2 trillion a year by spending $1 trillion a year. It's a really, really simple mathematical equation. As you can see, it's worth doing. And then you've got a whole series of other debates about whether or not running refineries is cheaper than running battery storage and all that stuff, but that's almost a secondary debate. Overall, it's going to be, you spend money to save money. And there's one final point about CapEx. This Oxford paper I mentioned earlier, they calculate that the faster we change, the quicker costs fall. And actually, from their calculations, if we do this intelligently and rapidly enough, there will be no incremental capital cost. I can't comment on whether that's going to be right for sure, but the point nevertheless remains that we should not be held back by this enormous number of 100 trillion. It's a totally achievable shift when it comes to capital.
Thank you. So that's very logical, which is maybe not always the way business and government and everything thinks. So, Tim, in terms of the capital requirement, is there a role for government in that? And what do we do about the cost of capital?
So I think there is a huge role for government in all of this. If we had kind of 200 years to do this transition, we could probably, very gradually and incrementally introduce some kind of pricing mechanisms, and you get there. But we haven't. We've only got 30. And as Kingsmill said, we all know energy is the backbone of society and the economy. So I think there is a huge role for government there. When I look back to when we designed the CFD, people, sometimes asking, where did you start? And the place that we started was the cost of capital. Under the RO, the cost of the renewables obligation, the cost of capital was very high because renewable generators had a set of risks related to the wholesale price that they could not manage. So the whole kind of purpose of the CFD, if you like, was to get the cost of capital down, and the deployment and the technology cost reductions and the innovation we've seen as a result of, in particular, offshore wind deployment has all flowed from that, from getting the cost of capital down. But the way we did that was essentially around de-risking, and I think that was the right thing to do because renewables generators were bearing risk that they could not manage, and it was still a relatively nascent sector, certainly in the UK. But I think the challenge ahead for government is how do you get the right risks in the right places? Because with renewables as the backbone of the system, I think there are a different set of risks around energy security, around how you incentivize storage and all those kind of things. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is just to pick up on the leapfrogging point, because globally that challenge is very different. In the UK, with a pretty mature market structure, even if it's one that needs reform, with a pretty mature policy structure, legal structure, etc., that is one thing. Trying to do this, and many of you will know this, in countries which do not have those structures in place, where only 30 or 40% of people even have reliable access to electricity at all, is a very different challenge. And I think there is a real responsibility for the UK and other countries to help those countries which have an advantage in that they're not trying to design over a very long existing market with real vested interests and incumbency issues and all that kind of thing. That's an advantage that they have, but a big disadvantage is that they don't have those structures and those financial structures in particular to deliver the investment that we need. The third thing I'd say, and I think this is really important and we need to not forget it, is it's partly about getting the incentives right for renewables and for low carbon and for storage and for other assets, but we also really need to disincentivize the stuff that we don't want. And at the moment, as you say, money flows where the investment case is there to be made. We've seen some, I think, genuinely really ambitious announcements on coal today, and we'll hear more about them later on. That will not happen because governments will it. It has to happen because governments get the incentives right to build the stuff that we need and to stop building this stuff and stop running the stuff that we don't need. And in some ways, that side of the coin, in particular, given the incumbency challenges, given the genuine economic reliance that some parts of the world have on fossil fuels, is going to be an enormous part of the challenge as well.
Absolutely. So Mary, on the finance point and the cost of capital, what's your view from the developer side?
You know, again, a very similar theme in that there is absolutely no shortage of capital. You know, in fact, there's an abundance of capital, and I've had the same conversation over and over again with several different players over the last number of months, and it's a really common theme. It's that, you know, I was raising a fund, we had a target of, say, 2 billion, we were oversubscribed, we said we were going to close it at, say, 5, and actually we took in 7. And then the next sentence is, from every single one is, and now my problem is, where am I going to deploy that capital because there's a shortage of opportunities. And that capital is all chasing, you know, again, as Tim and Kingsmill have referenced, it's all chasing the de-risked, you know, renewable energy assets that fits the mandate of that capital. And, you know, so as much actually as energy systems need to reform, also capital markets need to reform and also need to be turned on their head somewhat. And, you know, there is a challenge for that pool of capital to follow where the opportunities are, and it will be a different investment mandate, and it will be a different type of profile of investment. But, you know, their problem is there not being enough opportunities to invest in. So it certainly has to take a different approach. And from the multilateral perspective, like, there is a very significant role that the DFIs are playing and can play more of, like I referenced earlier, in terms of, you know, financing EVN in Vietnam or Eskom in South Africa, so as to invest in transmission upgrades, and that can play, you know, a really significant role. And we need to see more and more of that, and we need to see it faster for certain. And also, you know, in terms of the significant capital levers, also the corporate offtake market, you know, the growth of that market in terms of the very large corporates being the buyers of energy and seeking renewable energy solutions, you know, that is a very significant, again, driver and a pool of capital that is more and more, again, deploying across, you know, the growth and emerging economies. But again, to pick up on one of Tim's points, you know, the kind of the elephant in the room is that the market incentives and disincentives need to be in place. You know, there needs to be a price on carbon, and that needs to be addressed. And I know it's an extremely complex issue, because, you know, that then, you know, drives capital, that drives decision making, that drives investment appetite, and, you know, I think that's a huge challenge that really needs to be tackled.
Thank you. So I mean, I completely reckon my day job takes me into the world of investors, and as you say, there's absolutely no shortage of money. There's a shortage of projects that fit their mandate and their level of returns. But if we're going to access that capital, we're going to be asking them to take more risk, and if they're going to take more risk, then they want higher returns, and that's going to flow through to the cost of energy. But we want to keep the cost of energy really, really low. So where are we going with this? Are we, and to the consumer point, Tim, that you raised earlier, in consumer behaviour and expectations, how do we kind of square all of these issues, given that we have an opportunity to shape something different going forward? Tim, I'll start with you, the nice, easy question.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that question. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is, I don't think they are taking more risk. I think they're taking a different kind of risk, and a risk they're unfamiliar with. But, you know, I think the riskiest thing you can do right now is probably investing in fossil, right, for a whole bunch of reasons. Not least, you know, the direction of global policy and the resilience challenges that creates for wider portfolios, and all those kind of questions. I think the key thing for me on your question about, you know, how do you do this, I think there's a bit of, we have to go back to the kind of politics of this. And as I said, the politics of energy actually have been relatively benign over the last 20 years in comparison to the century before that. I think we do need to have a much more honest and open political conversation about the fact that things are going to be a bit different in future. I think we need to have a conversation about how we spread the cost of that transition, because essentially what we're saying here, and if you look at the overall, in the UK Climate Change Committee modelling about the cost of getting to net zero, what you see is a lot of capital investment, in particular in the 2020s and 2030s, and you see a lot of savings in the 2030s and 2040s as fuel costs come through, in particular to transport. So how do we manage that? Feels to me like the absolute $64,000 question, because the total amount of money we need to spend is not all that high. The investment requirement is about equivalent to what we spend on defence each year. Now, I don't think anyone argues that our defence spending is going to collapse the economy in the way that some people argue net zero spending will. So I don't buy that argument. But I do think we need to think about how we spread that. First of all, how we're honest with consumers about the kind of changes that are going to need to be made and the role that they're going to have to play in those, because they are going to have to get heat pumps and new heating systems, and that isn't necessarily straightforward. But secondly, how do we spread those costs in a way that is fair to the people, paying those at the point when those capital investments are being made, and then fair to those who are getting the benefits in terms of the savings later, but also in terms of a much more livable planet as well. And that, to me, feels like a very kind of immature political debate at the moment, but it needs to move quickly.
Thank you. Kingswell?
Well, look, just quickly on this global issue. Bloomberg New Energy Finance releases annually this climate scope report, and they look at 100 countries and they rank all the countries by their policies, what they're doing to encourage the growth of new energy technologies. There are two astonishing things about this. First of all, 60% of the countries in the world don't have any policies. So, this is precisely Mary's point. There's plenty of capital out there, and there are plenty of countries just doing nothing, like literally nothing, to encourage getting the money, not even putting into place the facility to deploy solar or wind. So, there's some really very, very low-hanging fruit out there for countries to change their policies. And then the second point that BNEF makes, they say, look, countries that do put in place the right set of policies as they define get, from their calculations, 17 times as much money as those who don't. So it's really not rocket science. You want this stuff, you put into place the policies, it's cheap, it comes. So that's, I think, a significant point about the global debate. And if I may pick up on Tim's point about the kind of cost of this stuff, we shouldn't forget, as my colleague Sam here points out, that you do have natural depreciation going on in any system, right? A car lasts for 15 years, so that means that you get natural depreciation of the global car fleet of 7% a year. You get natural depreciation in the global coal fleet of 3% a year. We can actually use the natural depreciation to our advantage in this energy transition simply by not building new stuff. And that's why all these kind of policy decisions being made here at COP about not building the new, and the IEA's point about we don't need any new fossil fuels is so incredibly important. And it really helps make the maths balance and mean that we can do it without huge incremental cost.
Okay, thank you. Mary, what's your view in terms of taking different risk, or not necessarily relying on the risk being underwritten by guaranteed revenues?
Yeah, I think that Kingsman's point is exactly correct in that we absolutely know what works, and I could talk all day around what's required with very clear regulation, policy, long-term planning frameworks, permitting regimes that we know what works, and definitely more and more of that is required. And what does encourage me is that, and I think should encourage us all, is how much the conversation has changed. It started with going back, I suppose, several COPs. It started with the why, in terms of, do we need to combat climate change, and that question is completely closed now. That's a given. And now then it moved to the what, and then the what being the alignment broadly in terms of establishing net zero targets. And now, it's moving into the how. How are we going to do it? Moving from the words and the ambitions to the actions. And then, with more and more of that how question being addressed and answered, and significant progress being made, then, capital will flow accordingly. I think capital still has and I'm talking very, very broadly, needs to challenge its thinking. It's also, a system that's designed for yesterday's world, as opposed to really fully flexed yet for today's and tomorrow's world. But you know, with the focus now being on the actions and the how and the untangling of all of these questions, which are very challenging, interlinked, complex, but you know, it's moving in the right direction for certain, and the challenge is on all of us to find the answers to these very significant challenges.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So finally, as I noticed from the time that we're almost at the end, but here we are at COP26, very exciting. We've heard some announcements already. But if each of you could just, you know, kind of give me a quick 2 or 3 sentences on your hopes, expectations or ambitions from this event in the context of the energy system of tomorrow. Kingsmill?
So we put out a paper before COP, which already tried to answer this question. So, and we basically said, look, there's lots of detailed stuff that needs to happen, but the main point is that we need to cement the narrative of gain, not pain, right? This is not going to be, this is going to save the planet, not destroy it, as it were. And I everywhere I look around me, I'm seeing evidence that this is starting to take hold as the narrative, and that's fabulous. And I'll mention, I guess, 2 other kind of sub hopes. One is that we can really cement peak fossil fuel demand. And we think at Carbon Track it was basically 2019. We just have to make sure we stop building new stuff, and all the policies on that are very helpful. And then finally, I think Mary's point is brilliant. You know, we've just got to do the how. You know, how are you going to do all this stuff? Let's have the detail. I think it's a really good point. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I think 3 things I would say. The first is that my kind of hope is for hope coming out of this summit, and a kind of positive. I think to some degree the success of this summit is whether people think it was a success. And you know, when I think back to Copenhagen and you know what happened there, that kind of set everything back 4 or 5 years. You know, and was pretty disastrous. I don't think we're in that space at all. I think we've seen some really positive stuff coming out so far. So the first thing is about, you know, a kind of really can-do mentality globally coming out of it. The second thing is that we need to take much more seriously the transition, in particular in the developing world, and the support that needs to be provided to lower income countries to enable that to happen. I don't think there's been enough of that. You know, Copenhagen was where the 100 billion commitment was made. That still hasn't been met 12 years later. You know, that is real kind of important basic stuff that we need to get right and start taking more seriously globally. And then the third point, I guess, is a variant on Mary's, which is, you know, this is now about practical action, because we've seen some really positive announcements on deforestation, on methane, on coal. You know, we're going to see more on transport, no doubt, and many other areas as we go through. But as I said earlier, because governments say something's going to happen, and you know, the will not make it happen. It is about practical policy implementation, practical investable instruments that people can, whether it's investing in a heat pump, whether it's investing in a 2 gigawatt offshore wind site. We have to have the practical action very quickly coming out of this summit, because the risk is that, you know, you lose momentum and you know, after everyone sort of collapses and needs to sleep for a week or 2 after this summit. But after that, we need to really get on with it. Stop focusing on targets and start focusing on practical delivery.
Yeah, very similar. You know, the focus on actions and really tangible outcomes and next steps, and also that sense of optimism. You know, that sense that COP26 was a huge success, that this was a turning point, that Glasgow set the scene for a really significant period of change. And I think, you know, a lot of that needs to be then, like, the focus on, there's so much that we know that does work. We spend a lot of time talking about the challenges and the things that are very difficult and complex, but we should spend, you know, more and put more energy into what does work and the opportunities that are there, because we really have, you know, an awful lot of the answers. We have a lot of the technology. Innovation really is flowing, and I'm really encouraged also by that and by the pace at which it is happening. So, you know, so for me, it's 2 things. It's confidence, it's hope, it's focus on opportunities, but in a really tangible manner in terms of actions.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's been really interesting, and I think incredibly positive, some really strong messages coming through, looking forward and doing things differently. So thank you very much, everyone. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure our panelists will quite happily answer any burning questions that anyone has if you come to them after we're off the stage. But in the meantime, I just want to say many thanks for their insightful and knowledgeable contributions, and for making this session as interesting as it has been. I hope that the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have, and that we have left you, if not with all of the answers, then at least some of the answers, as well as plenty of food for thought.
So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a 2 or 3 minute technology break. Thankfully, we don't need to rearrange the stage, we just need to rearrange the microphones. I had hoped when we started our conference today that this panel would set an extraordinarily ambitious task for the rest of our panelists, and they have delivered in spades. They have taken us into a future dominated by renewable energy, with an energy market that is no longer a lasagna. So I'm now launching the Mainstream Malin Group competition, which is to come up with the other item of Italian cuisine that best describes the energy market of the future. And there will be a prize, as yet undisclosed, for the most imaginative gastronomic response at the end of today. Anyway, bear with us for a couple of minutes, and then I will call on Cameron Smith to chair our next session on offshore wind, the energy backbone of tomorrow's energy markets.